Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show and our special series with former FBI Director Robert S. Mueller.
And so for those of you who are in public life, who are in public service, there's so much about that because there's other opportunities, but yet you do it because you want to make the world a better place. There is no one person in the United States of America that I think exemplifies that concept better than the former director of the FBI, Bob Mueller. We work at a firm, Wilmer Hale, which is a big firm that has work all over the country. But I've known his history from way before we became partners at the law firm. I knew his history when I became a U.S. Senator because he would often come to the Senate to give us briefings on some of the most highly confidential intelligence that we were dealing with in our country in the days after 9/11. And I knew his time then when I worked on the cabinet because he was part of the national security apparatus, meeting with the President of the United States on the situations that were occurring all around the world. But I think of Bob Mueller as this person who has done so much for this country. You know, as a young Marine, he was wounded, the decorated veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, a Bronze Star recipient. But he went on to become a lawyer, a great lawyer, a prosecutor. And then when he was summoned to be director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he was asked to go into that position just about a week before 9/11. President Bush appointed him to be director of this greatest of law enforcement agencies in the world. And that was about a week before 9/11. 9/11 happens on his watch. He did such a terrific job for the United States of America in terms of getting us to understand what our security issues were here in this country and how those security issues played out internationally, that even after President Bush left office, that President Obama, now a Democrat, said that he wanted to keep Bob Mueller on as director of the FBI. Now, some of you have read the histories and the stories of J. Edgar Hoover, and people thought that there should be a limitation on the number of years that someone could serve as director of the FBI. And so there was a law that was passed that said you're term limited, you can only do 10 years. But President Obama and President Bush and everybody in the country thought so much about Bob Mueller, thought so highly of him, that they went to Congress, President Obama went to Congress, and he says, we have to change that law so that we can keep Bob Mueller. And so Bob Mueller continued to serve President Obama for many years, and today he is in the books of the history of our country as the longest serving director of the FBI next to J. Edgar Hoover. So I want you here in Colorado to give the greatest, most wonderful welcome to a person who is a true servant of the people, and that is Director Bob Mueller. If Aaron Harber hadn't, if he'd won that election, I'd probably be doing the show and he'd probably be president of the United States.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Let's give a hand to Ken Salazar, please. Mr. Director, thank you for joining me.
A pleasure.
It's always good to have a former FBI director because when Bob was director and I asked him a question, I think 9 out of 10 times he said no comment. No, it wasn't that.
It'll only be 5 out of 10 now.
So, we talked a little bit about 9/11, and there are actually people here, a few, who were either not born yet in 2001 or were just born that year. And so obviously the memory of that for many Americans is faint or non-existent. Let's talk about where you were on 9/11 and what happened.
Well, as Ken pointed out, I started, I was sworn in a week before September 11th and was just getting my feet on the ground, so to speak, learning the organization when 9/11 came around. And on that day I was just in a conference room outside my office getting briefed on another terrorism case. And an agent comes in and says, Director, there's a plane that struck a tower in New York. And you look outside and you ask, well, what's the weather like up there? It's beautiful in Washington. I said, beautiful. And by the time you've had that discussion, another agent comes in and says, well, Director, another plane has struck a tower in New York. And by that time, we understood that this is something unique, quite probably, quite possibly some form of terrorist attack. And very shortly afterwards, the plane went into the Pentagon, right across the Potomac, and we from our offices could see the smoke coming up from the Pentagon. We knew by that time it was a series of terrorist attacks. I think we probably suspected bin Laden and Al-Qaeda because of their capabilities at that point in time. And we went down to a room on the 5th floor, our situation room we call it, where we go whenever we have a crisis along those lines, any terrorist attack. And we're in a room with a feed from the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. And we're down there for 5 or 10 minutes, and a voice comes over the loudspeaker and says, hijacked plane, inbound Washington, D.C., 80 miles out. And what I remember most vividly is sitting there and going through your mind is, there's a hijacked plane out there, and the target is someplace in D.C. Is it the Capitol? Is it going to be the White House? Is it going to be the FBI building? And 5 minutes after that, a voice comes on again and says, hijacked plane, inbound Washington, D.C., 50 miles out. And of course, that plane never made it to Washington because it was taken down by the passengers and was driven into the fields of Pennsylvania.
Flight 93.
Flight 93, yes. But what sticks with me is the surreal being there, knowing that a series of attacks had occurred, and there's one more that is going to hit.
So what steps did you take at that point? What happened? And from the inside, I'd like to know, what happened?
Well, first of all, I was brand new. So one of the things I knew and understood is I had to get out of the way and let the FBI do what the FBI does best. They didn't need me meddling after a week on the job. One anecdote, I called into the FBI headquarters maybe a day or two after September 11th at night. And I call in, get the FBI operator, and she says, FBI. I say, this is Bob Mueller. She says, who? I said, the new director. She says, oh, okay. And I went on to say, well, I want to know who is in charge. And I think I said, situation room. And she pauses for a second. She says, well, you want to know who's in charge? I said, yes. She says, well, you're in charge, Director. And, you know, I saw the daylight. I had some responsibility. I'll tell you the most meaningful juncture after that for the Bureau, and me personally, was the first briefing I did to President Bush in the Oval Office a day or so after September 11th. I had been in the Oval Office once before. I'd been interviewed for the job of FBI director, and I'd been in there the previous July with George Bush and his chief of staff and the like being interviewed. And as an aside, in the course of the interview, my cell phone went off. And so and I'm sitting there in the Oval Office with the president and the chief of staff, and my cell phone is going off wildly. You can imagine how I felt. I think I half got to my feet and said, oh my God, I am dead. But the president said, that's okay, sit down, we'll get through it. And it comes to find out that it was my wife calling me to ask how the interview had gone. So I'm in there for the first briefing of the president. And you've got to understand that I had spent almost all my career as a prosecutor, investigating cases, pulling together evidence, and putting that evidence in a courtroom in the hopes of prosecuting successfully somebody who had committed bad acts. I start my briefing, and it's President, Vice President Cheney, George Tenet, head of CIA, and a couple of, well, actually 4 or 5 others. And I start by saying, well, Mr. President, we've got command posts set up in where the planes went in. We have started to identify the persons responsible by their seat numbers. And I get about 2 to 3 minutes into it, and President Bush holds up his hand and says, Bob, hold on a second. He says, what you're telling me you're doing to identify the persons responsible is what I expect the FBI to do. You've been doing it for 100 years. But my question to you today is, what is the FBI doing to prevent the next terrorist attack? What is the FBI doing to prevent the next terrorist attack? And I felt like a high school student who had gotten the wrong assignment, because I had not thought of that. That's not the way I thought. The way I've been trained and brought up was you get evidence, you put it in a courtroom, and somebody goes to jail. And I can assure you that that was the last time I failed on that question. And I ended up briefing President Bush every day, excepting weekends his first term, at least once a week his second term, at least once a week with President Obama his first term, and at least every other week in his second term. And I can tell you that their focus in each of those briefings was on that question and how we were answering that question. What are we doing to prevent the next terrorist attack? Out of that came three basic changes to the Bureau. One was prioritization. We had to understand that counterterrorism was going to be number one, counterintelligence, protecting our secrets from the Chinese was number two, and cyber was number three. On the criminal side, it was public corruption and civil rights, because if we did not do those investigations in cases, they don't get done. Transnational, international organized crime, white-collar crime, and violent crime. And everyone in the Bureau was told that these will be our priorities and they will be addressed in order. We had to drop some areas where we were doing a lot of work. We moved 2,000 agents from the criminal programs, 1,500 from the drug programs over to counterterrorism, and 500 from smaller white-collar criminal cases over to counterterrorism. Second area is building up an intelligence capacity, understanding that we had to gather facts, pieces of information, not just those facts that would be admissible in a courtroom. We went from 1,000 analysts to 3,000 analysts to accomplish that. And lastly is partnerships. We, before September 11th, both by statute and otherwise, did not get along with the CIA, and the CIA did not necessarily get along with us. But we fully understood in the wake of September 11th, you had to break down those walls. Congress did, and the Patriot Act broke down the statutory walls between us. And then we worked very closely together, both personally and organizationally, George Tenet and myself, to break down the other cultural walls that had grown up between the instances.
And those statutory walls were really, I mean, the FBI's purview was really limited to domestic activities. You were not active outside of the country, and the CIA had the opposite. They were international and not allowed to conduct activities in the country. So, I mean, that change where, and the programs you've done with me before, you know, you've discussed that change, that was a sea change. And I'm really interested in what kind of progress actually occurred during your tenure and how effective was it?
Well, I walk into an institution, and I had not been in the institution myself. I had not been an agent. And so you go in an institution where the mandate is such that you have to change what you do. You have to change the thinking of a certain segment of the population in the organization. You know you'll never get a portion of it, and we have a long history of pride in what we do. There were a number of things we did at the outset. When the criminal programs had been dominant, the leadership from the Bureau came from the criminal programs. When terrorism starts to dominate, the leadership from the organization comes from those who have come up through the ranks of national security. In every organization, if you join it, they're the real leaders, and they're the leaders with titles. And one of the things that's important to find out is who in the organization is a real leader, people respected by the troops, regardless of their title, because often the person with the title is not the real person that makes the organization move. And then I understood that it was a transition from Hoover years to change, and so during that period of time, we wanted continuity in a number of ways. I kept on people that were part of the prior organization that were absolutely essential to the future of the organization. I did silly things like wear a white shirt every day, was very formal because that is the Bureau. And in a number of ways, I tried to bridge that transition. Everyone in the Bureau felt horribly that, to a certain extent, greater or lesser, that we had failed the country in not stopping it. And so there was a huge catalyst within the organization, an understanding of change that would not have occurred had that tragic series of terrorist attacks taken place.
You know, one of the fascinating aspects is that since 9/11, we haven't had, obviously, that kind of attack on American soil. And I'd like to know your thoughts about how that was accomplished, because it's kind of, to me, it's kind of like how you view referees or umpires. If they're doing a good job, you don't notice them. It's when they make a mistake that you notice them. And here we, have gone by 1.5 decades without a recurrence. And I would say most of us in September of 2001 expected more to happen. Why hasn't that happened?
Well, I probably take issue with the fact that we were very successful. We weren't successful 100% of the time. We had Fort Hood, where Major Hassan killed 13 people. And quite obviously, and notably, we had the Boston Marathon bombings. And every time you have something like that, you instinctually, you spend a lot of time with the victims and their families. And so it sears you when you don't stop an attack. I had worked on Pan Am 103 way back when, so I had some familiarity with that. But generally, key to all of this was the partnerships between ourselves and the CIA, and most particularly, more than anything else, our partnerships with state and local law enforcement. And we established over 100 joint terrorism task forces around the country, where the principal players on those task forces would be FBI agents, yes, because we had access to international information, domestic information, but the key entities on those task forces were the state and local police officers who knew the communities and could, in advance, try to identify the threats that you faced.
If you had to pick your most challenge, your biggest challenge, in your opinion, while you were a director, what was your biggest challenge?
Well, there were two. One was, I think, to have the organization know and understand the future of the Bureau, which had to change somewhat dramatically from what it was in the past. And almost everybody who had joined the Bureau before September 11th, and I was adjusted, including myself, I saw the role as the prosecutor and the investigating agency that brings persons to justice. And that is very satisfying when you're working in that. You successfully complete an investigation and the person is prosecuted successfully and goes to jail. There's a feeling of we've accomplished something, you move on to the next. Doing national security cases is gathering in small pieces of, not evidence, but information, putting it together and coming up with a matrix that'll allow you to prevent a terrorist attack, and it does not have that same satisfaction. But having the organization know and understand it's not what we want to do, it's not what we joined the FBI to do, but what the American public expects us to do through the voice of both presidents was probably the biggest challenge. The second challenge came in upgrading the information technology, which was a real challenge. Anybody that's had to upgrade technology in an institution knows wherever I speak, there was a contract that we had with contractors to give us new networks. I mean, we were back when I entered in 2001. Our technology was back in the 60s, if not the 50s. So networks, hardware, and then a new case management system, software package. We were fine on the hardware and the networks. It's when the case management system was being developed for millions of dollars. I was told that in a year after I'd arrived, 2002, 2003, one day we'd go in and turn on our computers, and everybody in the Bureau would have a new case management system that was on the cutting edge. And so that, instinctively, I was saying, I don't know how that's going to work, but I got glowing reviews all the way up to about 2 or 3 months before this date was to occur. And we get to the date, and lo and behold, we had 6 teams working on it, but they were not really integrated. And consequently, they would not start, and there was some question as to whether it would ever be successful. So you're caught on the one hand, are you going to pour more money into this one that may or may not be successful, or start again? We ended up starting again. But I kick myself for not having asked the hard questions early on, intuitively, and giving it over to the CIO and others, delegating, which is a good thing to do, but this is an area where I should not have delegated.
What is there something else that you didn't accomplish that you wish you had accomplished?
Oh, they're small. There are a number of things. We have a database. People listening, if the Bureau here, just to understand, we generally are responsible for all of the statistics on bank robberies and have been for eons. And we added a database on that, which was one of my first things on my list to get upgraded. It was all done by hand. As I'm leaving, 11 or 12 years later, I don't think it's been upgraded. A bunch of other things have been done, but it's one of those things that you think that you're going to do, and other things come to the fore.
What about the role of FBI agents today in the field? How's that changed?
It's changed in the sense we're doing far fewer, say, narcotics cases, for instance. And when you're doing narcotics cases, they're fugitive cases or active violent crime cases, which we all love doing, you are in the field much more. You're on the streets much more. You're developing a different type of confidential source than you're developing when it's a national security priority. And you don't have the satisfaction of doing a search warrant and getting the goods, arresting somebody, and going through trial and then on to the next area. One of the interesting things about being an FBI agent in the FBI in the United States is that here we have plea bargaining in the sense that if a person is committed a crime and faces a stiff sentence, they'll get a lighter sentence if they cooperate. And that has been a tremendously important area of developing cooperation and information in the national security, most particularly the terrorism area. If you go to UK or any of the European countries, for instance, they don't have that. So persons are arrested for involvement in terrorism activity and just sit in jail. There's no incentive for them to come forward with the information. So doing a national security case where you have to develop the information off of wires, as we say, interceptions, as well as developing informants, it's done differently when you're dealing with a national security case.
There's been a lot of discussion over the last several years about turnover in the FBI. So talk about turnover and also just staffing. What are the challenges in terms of getting the kind of people that you want, and also resources? I mean, you ask any director of any agency, or do you have enough money? They're all going to say, I could always use more. But what's the situation with the Bureau in terms of the demands made on it, especially in light of what you said in terms of massive resources, in terms of staffing being shifted over to other areas?
Well, the fact of the matter is you always put in a request for more than you understand you're going to get, but it's a question of prioritization. If we prioritize terrorism, we're not going to be doing other things. We're not going to be doing the drug cases. And it's prioritization as dictated by Congress. Prioritization is dictated by the Department of Justice, the administration, and ourselves. Let me talk a little bit about the staffing. And let me talk about, to a certain extent, in the context of the balance between privacy and national security, which is a balance that we knew we would have to undertake day in and day out in the wake of September 11th. And it goes to our people. We will get something like 40,000 applications to be a special agent of the FBI each year, and with various skill sets and the like. And when I came on board, I was told that the average age of a starting class of agents is 30. And I say to myself, well, if it's 30, we're not getting people right out of college. The best and brightest may be going elsewhere and never end up in the FBI, but I was told, and I now believe it, that you've got to understand that we give FBI agents badges and guns and the power to affect persons' lives. And the most important quality for us and agents is judgment and maturity. We can pick up the skill set. I mean, we get people who are software programmers, hardware engineers, stockbrokers on for the insider trading cases who will come to us with these skill sets. But the most important thing for us is the judgment and maturity because of the power we give the agents. And one aspect of it that was started by my predecessor, Louis Freeh, is that every agent coming out of new agents class will have gone to the Holocaust Museum. And again, it is to impress upon our agents the role that they play in a democracy and the importance of having that judgment and maturity.
You talked about constitutional rights. I'd like you to I mean, because that's certainly an area you have great expertise. I'd like to hear more about the balance in terms of information being collected by the government and the decision in terms of what the government wants or what different government agencies want and what they truly need. I'd like you to make that distinction. And reference Edward Snowden. Certainly what Snowden did, I know when I had General Michael Hayden on the show, and we've had others heading up the NSA or the CIA, a lot of concern, great concern about some of the information released. But at the same time, Snowden certainly revealed to the American people what many of the activities of the American government were that I think a lot of Americans were disturbed by.
I don't disagree with the latter statement in terms of persons being disturbed by the activities. I would tell you that if you, as have individuals from the other agency to say he has done substantial damage to our capabilities when it comes to preventing terrorist attacks and other national security priorities. But if you look at the one aspect that was brought out early on was what they call the 215 issue, and that is the accumulation of metadata as to who called who when, and in one database readily searchable. And in the wake of September 11th, the 9/11 report came out and said there was a gap. We perhaps could have stopped September 11th if we had had that kind of database. And I give you an example of the position I'd be sitting in, and if you take the Boston Marathon bombing. It occurred on a Monday. We did pulled in all the video cameras in that portion of Boston. Were able to identify 2 individuals who put down knapsacks at the particular place where the bombs went off, but we did not know who they were. And because of that, we went on a Thursday night and published it, and they realized they were done. They got into a shootout outside of Boston. Older brother was killed, younger brother survived. And I'm sitting in the situation room, the same situation room sitting in on September, later on September 11th. An agent comes in and says, well, we've identified them and we have the brothers' information. My concern at that point in time is you've got one person loose out there. We have the example of 4 separate attacks on September 11th. My greatest concern is there's going to be another attack. And one of the important things for me to know is who had these people contacted. Where do I go to find out who may be helping them undertake an attack? And that readily searchable database was critically, I wouldn't say critically important, but used in that type of situation time and time again. It is still out there, and one last thing about the balance of national security versus privacy. We are the only country, and I put this to people who, particularly the media, who don't put it in, that requires the director of the FBI and the attorney general, if they want to intercept conversations, to go through a court, the FISA Court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court. I can't sign off on a piece of paper. Attorney General can't sign off on a piece of paper and do it. It's a third branch of government. No other country has it to the extent that we have it. And that is a pretty good, in my mind, guardian of our privacy, given the threats that we have, both domestic and overseas.
Do you think with FISA it makes sense to have an opposing party, as you normally have in court, possibly arguing against a request?
I think in certain circumstances in the past, the court has sought advice where it needs advice, and I think it'll do it in the future. I'm not certain exactly. I know that I think there was a statutory fix that allows that to happen. And so it'll probably be more prominent than it was before, but I don't think it'll change things much.
You know, in an open society, I think one of the things that many Americans don't appreciate is, I mean, we have such an open society that, which we want, that doesn't that really make us vulnerable in the sense that, I mean, you can come and go. We have the Second Amendment, so people can have and carry weapons, whether it's infrastructure, water supplies, electrical, communication grid, or whatever. Aren't we actually, in reality, on a number of fronts, very, very vulnerable?
I think we're certainly vulnerable when it comes to the type of information that is out there that is It was a type of information that is out there and available to those who want to find it and want to do damage or harm to us. We're also, to a certain extent, vulnerable by the fact that we live by the rules passed by Congress. I have to show, if I want to get an application before the court to intercept somebody's conversations, I have to show probable cause to believe that that person is affiliated with a terrorist group. And if I don't have that probable cause, I can't do it. We've had instances, Al-Aqwi, a relatively famous individual, exhorter of the type of terrorism we've seen in the United States, was doing videos and the like for a substantial period of time before the Fort Hood shooting, and it's only after that that we found that he was involved in the operations. Any other country, they may well have been up on his wire beforehand because there was no responsibility of showing a court that there's probable cause to believe that this individual is engaged in terrorist activity.
All right, one of the things I'd like you to talk about, a little insight on you personally, and I hope you can share the story with us a little bit. Because of your concern about constitutional rights and citizen rights, tell us a little bit, if you will, about the time when you and Jim Comey had concerns about what the White House wanted you to do, and this is, of course, when the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, I think, was actually in the hospital.
Yeah, he was ill. There came a circumstance where, in terms of it was time to reauthorize an interception that had been approved and ordered by the President. And in every previous application, it had been determined that it was legal to proceed. In this particular application, the Justice Department believed that it was not appropriate to proceed because of some legal issues, and the case was pressed by the White House, and basically Jim Comey and myself said we just would not be able to continue to serve if this wasn't straightened out, and ultimately the order was changed to pass the scrutiny by the Department of Justice.
So, I mean, you actually were, in essence, saying you and Jim Comey was the Deputy Attorney General at the time, but he was actually the acting Attorney General.
He was that too.
Because of the Attorney General being hospitalized. And I mean, you felt so strongly about this that you essentially were saying, we're going to resign if you proceed in this manner.
Yes.
I mean, I just think that's really extraordinary. Bob doesn't want me to talk about him like that, but I mean, I think that's just such a great model for people and
well, you really don't think about it as you go through it. You just try to do the right thing at the right time. That's
well, I wish more of us did that, I guess. One of the big issues, Bob, is certainly with law enforcement and community relations, and some of the issues in relation to how citizens and especially young people today view law enforcement. What are your thoughts about how do we improve communication? How do we improve community relations between law enforcement agencies, whether it be federal, state, local, and citizens, and especially young people? What are your thoughts on that? That's a pretty wide question. So.
Well, being an FBI agent, being a police officer in Denver or Aurora or any community is a tremendously rewarding job. To a certain extent, it goes up and down. It can be thankless as well. But you are really serving your community if you're serving as a police officer. I prosecuted homicide cases in Washington, D.C. for almost 3 years, where I spent much, if not most of my time in the courtrooms along with homicide victims, families, and the like. And it tears apart a community, and there's no more valuable function to the safety and security of a community than the police forces. If you look at what happens overseas, where we end up in Iraq and Afghanistan and what have you, the military can do something, but it should be the internal police forces that are responsible for the safety and security of that community. So it's tremendously important. It's tremendously important that younger people think of this as an occupation. I am a great believer in task forces. If you have to sit down and share a Coke or a sandwich or what have you with somebody in a different force, more power to you. And to the extent that you can have something like what the Bureau has, we have what's called the FBI Citizens Academy, where we bring in citizens from the community and take them through a course that shows them exactly what we do. That is tremendously beneficial. But community policing, having the persons that are policing being integral to the community is the way out of the problems you have. The last point I'd make is training. The problem with training is always the last thing on your budget list. It's the first thing to get cut, and it should not be. And it should not be if you're doing street-to-street activity to suppress crime.
We lose 30,000 or more people a year to gun violence. 33,000 people a year die through the use of guns. 2/3 of that is from suicides. And our numbers are just extraordinary compared to other countries on a numerical basis, on a per capita basis. You have to have given this some thought. What is going on in our country where we're killing each other and ourselves at those kind of rates?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the violent crime rate in the United States has gone down rather dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years, until this year, where it is rising rather dramatically in several of our cities. And if you ask the sociologists, you ask those who look at this, what are the causes of the reduction of crime? There is no one cause, and it seems to be unique to a particular city that they've had a reduction in crime, although it seems to have occurred over a period of time. Community policing is part of it. The fact of the matter is, in the United States, the Second Amendment, you have the right to carry arms, bear arms, and that is not a right that you have in other countries. There are other countries that are even worse than we are. In Latin America, some of the countries that where there's a turnstile in terms of gang members, El Salvador, other places where gangs are running rampant and guns are prevalent. So we've got some company out there, but boy, do we have a long ways to go.
All right, speaking of gangs, in terms of industrialized countries, certainly we've got such a variety of challenges with gangs, both gangs locally, as it were, others who've gone from city to city, some who have actually infiltrated from other countries. Mexico, you and I have talked about before. What's the special challenge, and how do we address that?
Each country has their own special challenge. We have the West Coast gangs, we have the East Coast gangs, we have the Midwest gangs, basically. They've grown up in different venues for 30, 40, 50 years. And it's very, very difficult to stop, and you will have episodic victories, but long term, you're not going to eradicate gangs. In any particular communities, you can successfully address it. But we're not the only country in this regard either. In Europe, Eastern European gangs. And also motorcycle gangs. You've got motorcycle gangs in the West Coast, the South. You've got motorcycle gangs in Scandinavia, for instance. And so gang activity is not necessarily unique to us.
All right, I'm going to jump to the international. I want to talk a little bit about cyber issues, cybercrime, terrorism. Daesh, or ISIL, seems to have had extraordinary success cyber recruiting. Am I wrong about that, or what's your sense of what they've accomplished, what they're doing? And I also want to know why are they allowed? Why do they have the opportunities to be in social media or on social media at all? Why can't we stop that?
Well, let me address the last one. It's with the First Amendment, right to speech. It often is a very fine line as to which it is. I think depending on the particular companies, some are better than pulling down websites than others. And I know there is efforts underway to find ways to convince the companies that are responsible for a great deal of the social media to be more proactive in stopping it. But the fact of the matter is the internet is so ubiquitous, the ability to move from place to place to place, you can staunch it for a period of time, but anybody who wants to find that propaganda will find that propaganda. As for the first part of the question, we are in a new age when it comes to, I think, cyber terrorism. 21,000 or so foreign fighters have gone to Syria or northern Iraq, and many of them have skills that previous generations have not had. We've started to see the use of those skills. They took down Channel 5 in Paris, and also we had the instance where they posted the names of our military, 100 plus military personnel with exhortations to others to go out and do damage to these persons and their families. That was undertaken by the cyber resources of ISIS. And with that numbers of persons coming in with those skills, we're going to see more.
What, there seems to have been so many breaches of security, including in the private sector. I mean, the Anthem case, 80 million records with people's names, social security numbers, birth dates, medical histories, the Office of Personnel Management in the federal government, that breach where you had interview information, fingerprints. Why are we even seeing that? And you would think that companies and federal agencies would be encrypting data, protecting data. Why isn't that happening?
Well, if you look at the Europeans have always used chips with their cards. We've used the band, the stripe, which is far less secure. Now companies are finally catching up with that to the extent that the economics are such that it drives the activity of our corporations. If you have not gotten them, you probably will get a card with a chip very soon. I always ask audiences, how many of you shopped at Target between Thanksgiving and Christmas 3 years ago? Yeah, including myself. I got my hands up there. And I say that because of all the people who were affected here in this room. Yes, you got a new credit card, but then you had to go online to the 15 or 20 various places where you got that credit card to change it. And the American people aren't going to put up for that for very long. And indeed, they are not, and so you have the change. Now, the other aspect...
By the way, I shopped there one time, and...
That's okay, so did I. Doesn't make any difference, I got the same letter. But one other sea change is what we saw with the Sony hack. For two reasons. One, there was a wiper virus utilized which wiped out half the servers and the hard drives, which makes it very difficult to identify who's responsible. But in this case, as the administration came out and said, it was North Korea. And so it was the first time where you have a foreign entity country that has attacked a U.S. corporation, which expands the dialogue to the responsibility of the federal government to protect against this or be active against it itself, as opposed to limiting the dialogue to just the criminal justice arena. Now it's a national security matter. And as it becomes a national security matter, on the table are far more options than you had before.
What are some of those options?
Well, I can speak generally to say enhanced defenses and with appropriate authorities and approvals, advanced aggressive response.
Are we under, whether it be corporately or the government, especially the federal government, are we under constant cyber attack by China?
Yes.
And what can we do about it?
Well, I mean, we arrested it was 5. We didn't arrest. We indicted 5 individuals from China up in Pennsylvania a year or 2 ago. There are activities are undertaken by the government to both identify and address both the FBI, CIA, NSA, the substantial efforts of China to get our intellectual property, and whether it be in the military side or the corporate side, and utilize those thefts to skip ahead in terms of developing the types of things that we develop here in the United States. I tend to think, though, that China can gather pieces of information But what you do not see is the capability of China to come up with an Apple or a Google or a substantial technological advance, whether it be with jets or with items on the internet, because they don't have the support of the financiers, for one, and secondly, the ingenuity that we display in the United States in coming up with a fix when we need a fix driven by the economics. And so while we undertake undergo terrorist attacks in the cyber realm, I am optimistic about our ability as a country, ultimately, when we get our act together, to address it.
Is there a solution to advance technologically simply to get our secrets?
Is there I'm sorry, the question?
Is there a solution in China in terms of to address that?
In substantial part, yes. And also to enter into joint ventures and the like, where they may have access to the technology and import it into China, and China would be ahead on that.
Let's talk about individuals and the cyber world. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about cyberbullying today in terms of, and also how young people use social media, the internet. Give me your thoughts, and maybe, not necessarily as the FBI director, but what are some themes or practices that are worth looking at?
Well, cyberbullying, I know, is being handled generally on the state side with state legislation. I look at it, frankly, as a father with children, with their ability to use Facebook and the like, knowing that anything you put on Facebook is going to be there and be there and be there and be there, and not just Facebook, just about any site. And who at that age understands the consequences of doing something when you're 16 that may come back to haunt you when you're 25 and you're seeking a job in not the private sector necessarily, but in the public sector that you really want, but some of the things that you said or done or taken way back when preclude you from exploring those options.
And when you're talking about that, the concept that even if once you post something, even if you take it down, that doesn't mean it's gone.
It's true.
And certainly a lot of people don't appreciate that and find out the hard way. One of the technological developments, and I don't know if you've given this much thought, but I'm fascinated by, are the use of drones, and the fact that you can buy a drone today for $50 with a camera and fly it on your own. In terms of privacy, what's your sense of where we should go with that technology?
Well, it's very useful technology. We use it, we have very few drones, but we use it in situations where we've got somebody is harboring a fugitive, or had been involved in violent crimes and is holed up someplace, and rather than have agents that physically do the surveillances, the drones are much more effective. The military certainly finds that as well. I mean, as a Marine, if I had a platoon, what have you, I'd want to look over the next hill to see what's there with a drone, as opposed to sending one of my corporals or privates or what have you over on either a listening post or an outpost to look at it. Yes, you can get from planes, C-130s and what have you, flying above, you can get some eye of it, but it is much more cumbersome, much more difficult. And so in the military, there is a use. In law enforcement, there is a use. But there's a great potential for abuse as well. And we as a society have not even started to scratch the surface as to how you limit or how you can keep an individual's privacy when you have drones outside your 16th floor apartment building looking in on you. There's got to be legislation. It's got to be addressed.
I'd like a big fly swatter myself, but...
well, we know what to get you for Christmas.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's talk about public service. I mean, we've obviously heard about your career a fair bit, but what's the state, in your opinion, of public service today, and how people view it in terms of importance or not?
I think a number of schools generally around the country, I think, really push some form of public service. I am a believer myself in a mandatory 2 years. Because I think everybody could utilize I don't care what you do in terms of public service, whether you're in a hospital or the Marine Corps or what have you, but I am a great believer in bringing us together if you have to do the 2 years of military service. Or not military service, some form of public service. And I think, like all things, if I'm mentoring somebody and I'm teaching at a university or college or something, want to know, well, what course do I take to have a career like you? Or should I take this course this summer? Or what job should I take here? Ultimately, 90% of you will be doing something you never anticipated. I mean, I never thought I'd be head of the FBI. I missed the cutoff stage. I thought I wanted to join it, but I got too old, so I couldn't join it, and I got in from the back end. But you don't know what you're going to do down the road, and to have 2 years of public service gives you a taste of what it's like to serve others, and it's tremendously beneficial. So I encourage everyone to do it.
Do you think our society doesn't encourage it enough, in the sense that there's certainly a tremendous emphasis on having financial success, and public service often is not correlated with financial success?
I think you're right on that.
So what can we do to encourage people?
Pass a statute that requires 2 years public service. It isn't going to happen politically. It's not going to happen, but that's where I'd go.
Do you think that the conflicts young people see with government entities, certainly a lot of the publicity in the last several years, reduces their interest in public service?
Perhaps. If they think the government is not working for you and would not want to be a part of it. But the fact of the matter is, everyone sitting in this room knows persons who are in public service whom you hold up as individuals to be appreciated because of the job they do. And the unique thing about public service is you get up every morning, regardless of the financial consequences, and you get to do what's right. And that's a freedom. It's a freedom that is hard to come by. But public service gives you that freedom to make those decisions without looking necessarily always at the bottom line.
In your public service career, and just in your career, do you think that Americans' perspective on our freedoms and the extraordinary freedoms we have those perspectives changed? Do you think we take our freedoms far too much for granted than we should?
You know, I don't necessarily think so. I do think that our freedoms will be articulated in different ways in the future, given social media and the impact of the internet. So that our freedoms will be defined, I think, somewhat differently, but it'll still be, amongst all the countries on this earth, we will still have the freedoms that we have been used to for 250 odd years, 200 odd years.
All right, the topic I want to jump to is leadership. What makes a great leader?
I think it depends on what you're talking about. A person can be a leader in the arts because of their capability and the like, and lead a significant life and be observed and appreciated as a leader. So I always ask when people talk about leadership, well, you want to be a leader in some place, or do you want to lead people? And if you want to lead people, that's a different ballgame altogether. And I never would have been where I was in the FBI without the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps teaches you some of the basics. Your men always eat first. You will never ask your men or women to do anything you wouldn't be willing to do yourself, and they darn well better appreciate that fact, or you would be an unsuccessful leader. You've got to learn to delegate. I mean, I look back at I didn't delegate terrorism because counterterrorism because I had to brief the president every day, and I micromanaged, much to the horror of people below me. But I delegated, I call them affectionately the geeks, the development of our next case tracking system, which was a mistake, and it has you focus on those particular areas. And then you have the opportunity to lead other individuals. And there are very few opportunities at a relatively young age coming out of college where you are given the responsibility for leading 30, 40, 50, hundreds of people in your 20s.
Can leadership be taught?
Yes, I do think that it can be taught. And some people adapt to it better than others. I mean, it's very lonely. I mean, one of the things you learn is the person that, particularly if you're in combat, but the person who is below you, your staff sergeant or your platoon leader or what have you, can't be a friend because of the things you have to ask. And there's certain aspects of it that are taught, inculcated in the academies in the Marine Corps at Quantico, and to a certain extent in different ways at large corporations who have leadership courses. I do think you can lead. Leadership can be taught.
What are, just from your own perspective, what are some examples of people who you think were great leaders? And you can go back as far as history as you want. And tell me why.
Well, this isn't, I just pick a couple. I have Lincoln for one. If we think we're going through troubles here in the United States now, the level of dialogue and discourse is run amok. Well, you look at what he had to deal with back and the issues that were on the table that he had to address during that period of time, and his ability to do it. We wouldn't be the country we are today without him. In another way, Eisenhower, in the sense that the huge leadership challenges that he had to undertake D-Day and put everything, all the building blocks in place so that we could be successful. Another substantial turning point in the history of the United States. Those are two that I'd sort of pick off the top of my head.
Tell me, when you look back on your career, and not that it's over, what are you proudest of?
I think I'm proud. I was asked this question a couple of weeks ago and gave it some thought. And I think I'm proudest of the fact that the Marine Corps had enough confidence in me to entrust the lives of the persons that served under me, particularly in combat. To have the Marine Corps decide that you measure up to their standards was, in my mind, a hugely significant achievement and confidence builder.
All right, last question. We have a lot of young people here today, at least younger than you and I are.
A lot younger.
Well, a few years. What advice would you give them?
Well, I'd keep your options open, but and don't settle on something unless you really want to become a doctor or lawyer or what have you. But the one thing that does stick out, and people, I don't really think of it, but people say that I have some reputation for integrity. And in thinking about it, it is tremendously important throughout life that you develop your own reputation for integrity. You can be a lawyer, you can be sharp in the courtroom, you can be very capable, but if you do not have a reputation for integrity, you will not make your mark on the bar. And developing a sense of it is not something that you focus on necessarily. It's in the way you make your decisions day in and day out. And it's the FBI stands for, our motto is fidelity, bravery, and integrity. And of those three, integrity would probably be the most important. One of the things I want to make certain of is when we send somebody up to the Hill to testify before Congress, we have a tendency to gild the lily, to characterize our efforts in glowing terms. And to the extent that you don't sit and hit the facts hard and resist the temptation to do that, then you contribute to your and the institution's reputation for integrity. And I would think of that and as something to aspire to, because once you've lost it, it's not coming back. Once you've lost it, people disbelieve you. And being honest with yourself, being honest with your family, being honest with your spouse, and feeding that perception, I think, is important to anyone growing up.
This segment features questions from the audience for former FBI Director Robert Mueller. The audience of over 500 attendees not only included FBI agents, Homeland Security officials, as well as other law enforcement officials but also had over 200 high school students from a number of different school districts.
My question is, you were instrumental in changing the FBI to an intelligence-led law enforcement agency. Could you please describe an executive decision that you made to help bridge the gap between the intelligence personnel and the field agents that trickled all the way down to help bring them together to work as a team?
Well, you focused on a very difficult issue that any intelligence/law enforcement agency addresses. You want the intelligence analyst together with the agents to provide a day in, day out a tactical intelligence, but you also want intelligence capability to look at strategic intelligence. I wrestled with the appropriate organizational structure to maximize both strategic and tactical. It doesn't often work easily, and what I found, I think, is that it depends on the personnel in a particular office. We had some offices that did terrific jobs in integrating the intelligence along with the investigative capability of the agents. And where we had good analysts, where we had productive analysts, it worked famously, and the teams were great. Other places where personalities, the persons on one side or the other didn't have the capability, it didn't work as well. But you touched on a problem that is a continuing problem and that needs to be reworked and looked at in an agency such as ours.
You know, Bob, one of the things I'm interested in is the fact that there are so many different intelligence agencies or departments. I mean, you have obviously the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and many, many more entities like the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. There seem to be so many different agencies. Is there a way, or does it make sense to look at maybe some kind of consolidation so there are better lines of communication? I don't even see how, with so many different agencies, that the members of each can communicate with each other.
There can be consolidation, but one of the facts of the matter is, and I think it's appropriately so, that we each gather information under certain statutory guidelines. CIA cannot gather information in the United States. I think it ought to remain that way. I don't think the CIA ought to be, and the FBI gathers information domestically. It can through our counterparts overseas, but we don't have the same authorities overseas as the CIA does. And I do think it's important to make certain that you align the responsibilities with the particular agency. The FBI has always operated principally in the criminal justice arena. If you're going to do a search, you're going to need a warrant. If you're going to do a wire, you need a warrant. The persons who are witnesses will probably be on the stand at some point, and so you are regulated by the criminal justice system. On the intelligence side of it, you are not, unless you go to the FISA Court. And my concern, quite frankly, was that we would lose sight of our goals where you don't have that monitoring by the criminal justice system. I think we've done it well, though, but it has been a concern throughout. Let me just put it that way.
Were a few mistakes made during your tenure?
Oh, sure. Actually, most of them, a mistake I made in terms of technology. If you're talking domestically in the FBI, sure, we've made some mistakes. Personally, some of the more grievous mistakes I ever made were personnel, where I put somebody in a position but didn't give them the support to get the job. I mean, some of my frustrations are the ones where I made bad choices, bad decisions when it comes to personnel. And many of the decisions you make are in response to critiques of your organization. And while you may get upset at a congressional panel or upset at the Inspector General, in retrospect, coming out of it were ideas and pathways that you perhaps would not have seen.
What do you do in cases where agents collected data or information without the appropriate authorization?
Well, whenever we do substantial internal auditing to assure that that does not happen. When it does happen, we find that on the one hand, you would discipline and take appropriate discipline in the agent. On the other hand, if the information was not appropriately taken, then we would discard it.
All right, thank you very much. And let's make sure some of our younger people feel free to ask questions. I guess we have some in line, but the more the merrier. Please go ahead.
Pueblo was ranked 11th on the national level for most violent crime rate per 100,000 people. And my father is a police officer in Pueblo, so I've talked to him about it in depth. And he states that the amount of police officers per popula is severely undermatched, that there are too many people per police officer that are on duty per day. So he figures that there's roughly 300 to 400 police officers on the force. And that's not every day going out patrolling the streets. That's office workers and working at desks. So my question to you would be, do you think that increasing the amount of police officers in Pueblo would decrease that crime rate on the national level?
Well, I am not going to parachute into what should happen at Pueblo specifically. I will say, though, that communities should address the capabilities and staffing of a police department depending on the crime. Many police departments now have reduced their personnel because crime has been going down. I mean, in Washington for a number of years there, we had homicides less than, I think they were less than 80 for a year, and we've been up in the hundreds. And consequently, communities, because of the expense and the like, will adjust their capacity. I don't know enough about Pueblo to speak to what would be appropriate there, but each community has to address it differently.
Do you sense nationally, is there any analysis which says there's a need for substantially greater investment in law enforcement in communities, or not?
No, because I don't think there are probably studies out there which would say that more police persons equal a reduction in crime, but it's not all that clear. I mean, technology, to the extent that certain communities are using technology, bullet spotter technology and video cameras and the like, crime is driven down not necessarily by the number of police officers on the beat, but by the technological improvements that are included.
What do you think? We talked about constitutional rights. A number of police departments now have the ability to mount cameras that scan license plates, and it's extraordinary the amount of data that they collect, the ability to identify very quickly stolen vehicles, things like that. What's your thought about that technological advancement and any constitutional rights issues?
I don't think that you will find, if it is addressed by the courts, any constitutional problem with a license plate that is displayed outside the car. I also think that is very valuable. There was a killing. I think it may have been the reporters, and I don't quote me on this, but look at the two reporters who were killed in southwestern Virginia. And I think that the individual who was responsible for that was picked up by a reading of his license plate. And even if it was not him, that is the type of piece of information that perhaps would have saved lives in that case, because I think he drove over the side of the road and then took his own life. And had he not been spotted, who knows? So I think I don't think there's a constitutional impediment, and I think it's valuable.
All right. Next question. Thank you very
sir.
much, by the way.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Nunziato, and I work with an organization called the Bridge Alliance, which is working to be a backbone organization to the transpartisan or cross-partisan field. So my question is how you have sensed what your concerns are around the hyperpolarized state of US politics and how that affects our internal division and our safety and around the issues of internet privacy and the like.
Well, so I understand your question. You're talking about the disarray in our political dialogue, how that would contribute or undercut the work of the FBI. Is that in essence what I think? The dialogue goes up and down. As I talked about, if you look through history, the back and forth and the lack of comity in the houses and like, this isn't the first time. And over a period of time, I was lucky because I stayed for a period of time. There are very good people up on the Hill. There's some not so good people. and you learn to take the good with the bad, on the belief that almost everyone up there perceives, rightly or wrongfully, that their particular actions are in the betterment of the United States. You may disagree with some, you may disagree with some of the rhetoric, but I don't generally discount the, not the enthusiasm, but the desire to make a contribution. And so basically you do your testimony and move on to the next.
Thank you very much. Next question, please.
My question is on leaks, not on the Snowden level, but say the bank account tracing and so on. And I wonder how much damage you believe the media has done in publicizing smaller leaks that come to them and that they print.
Well, depending on the issue, yeah, I think the media has been somewhat destructive. One of the concerns I have is when there is a leak of top secret or very classified information, the decision is made by the editors of the particular media, and they are taking into their own hands a decision as to whether or not it is against or undercuts national security by telling the public about this. And that, to me, should be left in the hands of Congress. Congress comes out, says disclose it, so be it. But the decision by the media to make something public upon occasion does substantial damage, and the decision is being made by one or two individuals in the media as opposed to by others in our democracy who are, one would say, perhaps better informed, but also much more cognizant of the damage that would be done by leaking a particular aspect of our defenses.
My name is Shifu Shong. I'm from Meade High School. So the question I wanted to ask you was, about a week ago, I remember I was on Facebook and there's this video saying that the Flashlight app, which most of us have downloaded either from the Apple Store or from Google Play, has like our personal data tapped. And so there's like a Trojan virus or something that's been installed from the app into our phone that has now our personal data. And so on the video it explained that China is one of them that now has our information. And so I was just wondering if you, Mr. Director, have any idea about that and know if the FBI can do anything to further prevent that from happening.
Well, I can tell you that the director was late today because he was downloading a number of different apps. He's a huge Angry Birds fan for many years, and I'm sure he can talk about that very directly, but I'll comment on it.
What happened to you? You were, talking in reality a few moments ago. On the apps, all of us are going to be, I tell corporations, give a fair amount of advice to corporations, say you either have been hacked or you will be hacked. Nobody is going to escape. Now, being the head of the organization, I am a target. I'm a target of Anonymous, LulzSec, you name the groups out there. And I periodically get calls from the bank saying, did you really authorize this money going to this country overseas? To which the answer is no. And it is, it's happened more than once. In any event, that's the life we live in now. And there are companies that are better at patrolling their apps and companies that are not. And I think the ones that are and those were not. But finding your way in this jungle is only going to get more difficult down the road, but it is the life we live in.
And what about the fact that I think a lot of people don't realize when they download an app that almost no one reads user agreements. Now, a lot of agreements for apps say you are giving them permission, for example, if you log on via Facebook, where they can download all your Facebook friends, where they can take all if you use Outlook or another database for email, they can download all of those email addresses. I think a lot of people don't even realize that they are giving permission for a company to have access to that information. Should there be, to protect consumers, should there be federal legislation which prohibits that says you cannot access people's personal information like that?
You see, I don't know to what extent, if you are using a mapping app, for instance, whether if you pass such a statute, there would be a backlash because you're not getting the same quality of service that you had before. And I just don't know that particular balance.
All right. Thank
I
you.
will tell you one point I should have made in terms of partnerships in the cyber arena. It's not necessarily state and local law enforcement. At the federal level, it's NSA, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security generally have the responsibilities for investigating domestically, the FBI, preparing the infrastructure, DHS, and then NSA overseas. But the critical partners in addressing cyber is the private sector. It plays a role in state and local law enforcement in some sense because the private sector has the evidence, you are the victims, and to the extent that we can break down the walls between the private sector and the federal sector, we will be successful. There have been a number of statutes that have been sitting up on the Hill that would give corporations a safe harbor if they provided information to the federal government on hacks. And that needs to be passed. Until we can exchange information on hacking indicia between the federal sector and the private sector, we're not going to be making the headway we should.
You know, one of the issues in regard to that is certainly consumers, citizens have been a number very upset and have expressed their displeasure to private companies with how some private companies have given in the past, have given government agencies access to their data. There's been, I think, a movement on a part of a number of high-tech companies to now encrypt that data so that it's very difficult for government agencies to access that information. What's the balance that should be struck there in that? You know, people don't want the government intruding into their private lives. At the same time, the government certainly wants access to certain information. What balance could you strike to make that work?
Well, I think it's going to be a piecemeal balance at this juncture. I started to say in response to a previous question, you have encryption that is substantial in this day and age, and encryption apps are a dime a dozen out there, so anybody now can encrypt. The encryption of a device by certain of the companies, whereby the only password, if I go and I'm doing an investigation into, I don't know, organized crime, or I'll just say organized crime, and I get a warrant from a judge saying that you can intercept the conversations of this particular individual, I go to the company and say, okay, I want the information off the cell phone. The cell phone doesn't keep the password. The password goes with the individual on the phone. And that has evolved over the last year and a half, 2 years, and is going to be predominate. And from the perspective of law enforcement, you are going to have persons whose lives are lost because you cannot have access to that information. You take my Boston Marathon bombing case. If there is information on that as to whom he had talked to recently about the next potential bombing, that's lost to you. That device is there like it's no better than a brick. And that's the problem that one has to address.
Mr. Director, my name is Chris. I'm a cybersecurity professional here in Denver, Colorado. And I'd like to know your thoughts and opinions. If you were the big cheese right now, would you be pushing for backdoors into encrypted communications, and why?
Thank you.
Well, the reason why I think is fairly obvious. We do a number of cases, violent crime cases, kidnappings, murders, and the like, and often the best evidence of that will be on a cell phone or can be picked up on conversations with appropriate court authorizations. There's an ongoing debate as to how you provide that continuous capability, but at the same time, encryption growing by leaps and bounds, which makes it difficult. I think we are going to have to sort out in the next several years exactly how we give law enforcement the tools they've had traditionally to be able to stop crime or terrorism, what have you, but understanding the change in dynamics with the advent of encryption.
All right, thank you very much.
My name's Torrin Rogers. I'm a recent transplant from Montana, now living in Boulder. My question is regarding the cyberbullying and harassment. I think there's a growing awareness of how prevalent and just the scope of what occurs, especially in the wake of events like Gamergate and the harassment of women online. When these individuals go to the authorities and say, look, my information has been compromised, posted publicly, My friends and family and I have received death threats. I'm not living in my home. The response they get is lukewarm at best. To your knowledge, what are federal and state agencies doing to correct this trend and sort of reinstill a sense of confidence in law enforcement's responsiveness to this?
Well, the fact of the matter is, there's the federal authorities. We got the FBI. We've got right now probably 13,000 agents around the country, around the world, and we got 400. We have 56 field offices, 400 resident agencies, and we cannot pick up every crime that we have jurisdiction over, or state localized jurisdiction over. And so complaints such as you have to be addressed generally at the state and local level, but I think it's very difficult, particularly in the cyber arena, where the person responsible for it can be outside that state or indeed outside the country. Mm-hmm. So it's a very difficult issue with inadequate resources that we have to address it. I'm not certain it's going to get much better in the immediate future.
All right, thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask if we can get, we just have a few folks in line, ask a quick question. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you, Director, for being here. My name is Katie Dunn. I work for the Twitter office in Boulder. There are many patriots in tech, more than you probably believe. However, the prospect of leaving the private sector to be forced to work with technology that in many cases is more than 30 years old is deeply unappealing. What is the FBI doing to attract top tech talent?
We, as I said, I think the last I saw was 3 or 4 years ago, we had 40,000 applications a year. And amongst those persons are persons that have those skills and capabilities in the cyber arena that we actually have built up over a number of years now. Prior to September 11th, you had to be in one of 4 categories to join the FBI: a former law enforcement, former military, a lawyer, or an accountant. Those were the 4. In the wake of September 11th, we realized our mission is much broader than that. In the wake of September 11th, we very quickly after that had the anthrax attacks, and there were more than 1,000 researchers in the United States that used anthrax, and we had to go and interview all of them. Well, we did not have the agents with a technical scientific background, but in the age of weapons of mass destruction, we had to build up that capacity. We've got more than 1,000 qualified investigative cyber agents now, a number of computer scientists. And the one thing to remember about cyber is that you always have a warm body behind the keyboard. And everybody talks about cyber investigations on the internet and the like, but the fact of the matter is, if you're doing a cyber investigation, you better know what the 3PLA, Chinese Army's arm is, in order to put the information you get on the attack with the persons behind the keyboards, and know what's happening in East Europe with the criminals. And consequently, part of it is the technical skills, but the other part of it is developing the capacity to do the traditional investigative structure that enables you to put that body behind the keyboard.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In your opinion, how intense is the threat posed by young people who are becoming influenced by cyber terrorism to join ISIS? And if you think that this is a result of a gap between local law enforcement and the youth, or something else?
Well, I think it's something else. It is the capabilities, enhanced capabilities of ISIS, or ISIL as you will call it, to focus on individuals who are weak and susceptible, and chart a plan and a strategy to draw those persons into that orbit. And they have been very successful, and I would say more so in Europe than the United States, but we have had, as Jim Comey, the current director, would say, we've got substantial numbers ourselves that have come up on our radar screen. And to a certain extent, it's like, it's persons joining something that gives them that they otherwise lack in their daily life. It's to a certain extent, although somewhat different, it's different necessarily than joining a gang, but the pressures may be the same and the susceptibility may be the same when you are joining something that other people perceive as being giving you giving you a character that you a capability and mission that you otherwise wouldn't have had.
So for us, it is very, very serious and difficult to identify and then to address.
What can parents do in terms of prophylactic measures to address that? I mean, obviously the numbers you're talking about, we've had our own cases, instances right here in Colorado, where in fact it was the FBI who was able to intervene and stop people from going ultimately to Syria or whatever to join ISIL or ISIS or Daesh. What can parents do? And isn't one of the big challenges that really the numbers are actually very small? You're talking about a tiny, tiny infinitesimal percentage of Americans affected in the way that you discussed.
But I mean, parents, religious leaders, other members of the community, employers, seeing signs of increased possible radicalization, should take it seriously, gather more information, and then either go to the religious leaders with the problem to try to resolve it early on, or go to the authorities.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, please. And you can all move up closer. You don't have to hide back there. Okay. Next question. Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, so my name is Brandon Livingston. I'm from Pueblo Centennial High School. And I just wanted to thank you for coming and talking to all of us. But I'm curious, do you think that social media allows for too much anonymity?
Anonymity?
Yes.
No.
No?
I do.
I mean, I know friends and everything who have Twitter accounts that they don't have to have their real name. I mean, do you think that could be taken advantage of?
I don't see how you stop it, frankly.
Yeah.
I don't, I mean, would you prefer otherwise? Absolutely. It would make our job, if you're talking about law enforcement, a heck of a lot easier. But unless you have a very advanced, well-developed app that requires sufficient pieces of information to enable you to, sufficient pieces of information to assure that you cannot use it anonymously, I think you're lost.
I think one of the sad parts of the ability to be anonymous, of course, is that the kind of speech, the tenure of that speech tends to be a lot more harsh, inflammatory, negative, and I think that's unfortunate when people hide behind that anonymity. And I think if they had to be themselves and be known who's saying things, I think it would be a kinder and gentler internet, but certainly that's not the case.
I'd probably make the case for public figures, for instance, who, if you're required, if they require me on each occasion to put my name, address, social security number, and the like on the internet, I've got a real problem. And I think there's another side to that coin in terms of persons who want to use the internet and can or would be targets, whether it be in the community or at large, would want some degree of anonymity.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, please. And you can all move up closer. You don't have to hide back there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Director, for being here tonight. My name is Matthew Clark. I also go to Niwot High School. And I was wondering for you, what do you think the greatest threat is to our national security today?
Ooh, good question. Why didn't I think of that?
I hate to, I hate to tear because I do believe in prioritization. But I tend to think that to individual Americans around the world now, as ISIS is a threat that I'd be most worried about. On the cyber arena would be the financial institutions and the infrastructure. Those are the two areas. Those are the three areas that I would think we are most susceptible. I know I saw the military has a slightly different view and belief that Russia may be the most serious threat. But where I spend most of my time in national security domestically, I don't have enough knowledge to know where you put Russia compared to these other threats I mentioned.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. I do have to tell you, the first time I interviewed the director, I was surrounded by about a dozen FBI agents. So this is a much less intimidating crowd than that experience.
There were only 4.
It looked like at least 12 to me. In any event, I'd like to thank the director. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, now it's...
The Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again. Hi, I'm Aaron Harber. The goal of my show is to inform viewers about a diverse range of topics, from our country's leadership to economic and tax policies to energy and environmental issues, with the participation of the most significant stakeholders in each arena. Our long-form approach gives each guest the time to fully speak his or her mind and gives the audience all the facts, allowing everyone to draw their own conclusions.
Thank God you do your homework, and just doing what you do is enough to begin to let them know what's happening.
I strive to bring together guests with perspectives from across the entire political spectrum to promote problem resolution through civil discourse.
Keith Olbermann and Glenn Beck and Rush Babe, frightening people and using emotion, fear, guilt, and racism. What a bunch, from the right and the left.
I've personally experienced our democratic system from the inside, and I use my knowledge and expertise on the show to get clarification of major points and expand the discussion to ensure my audience gets the uncut truth.
What is this bigotry against a third-party candidate? Do the two parties own all the voters and everyone else should shut up and stand in line?
We were on the campus together at Princeton University. Her Majesty does not look any different than she did in those days, and I wish I could say the same about myself.
I'm an ardent supporter of transparency in government and strive to play an active role in bringing out all the facts related to our nation's most challenging issues.
One of the things I've learned in life, and you certainly have learned from doing your show, is you got smart people, but they're torn apart, they're polarized. You get into a media environment where it's not things like your show, but the shout shows on talk radio or cable TV, in which there's just this tendency to score political points and be polarized.
Since my days in national talk radio, I've upheld a tradition of being truly nonpartisan, something which seems rare on the airwaves today.
Depending on your point of view, a decision of the Supreme Court might be the wrong one.
I've also found my guests talk to others involved in our nation's leadership, and they have encouraged them to come on the program as well.
We are not final because we're infallible. We are infallible because we're final. Now, no one knows what that means.
But it sounds good.
No, but what it
sounds
means
good.
is we do not have the last word because we are so brilliant. We are, of course, brilliant, but only in the sense that somebody has to have the last word.
It's the focus on issues rather than personal attacks that makes guests comfortable and gives them the chance to tell their entire story. I simply let guests explain their perspective completely, then dig deeper for the audience by drawing from my own knowledge and experience.
Democracy succeeds when you're giving more and more things to people, but the years ahead, we're going to have to ask more of them in taxes and expect less from government.
There doesn't seem to be anyone in either party that has any kind of appetite for asking more of people tax-wise. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're probably right, and that's a flaw in democracy.
Thanks for taking the time to check out the show. I hope this has been helpful in illustrating the nation's need for a balanced, nonpartisan program to shed light on today's issues. For more information, please go to www.harbortv.com or email producer@harbortv.com. And thanks for watching.